Our next guest is an internationally acclaimed photographer who has been to nearly 70 countries and has been on assignment for many publications. His cover stories include Sports Illustrated, Time, Newsweek, among many others. He is the author of The Real Deal, Field Notes from the Life of a Working Photographer. We welcome Joe McNally onto Hoopsology. How's it going, Joe?
All right. How's it going for you guys? Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on to the show. I've been really looking forward to this interview because I just read through your book and just going through your website. Your work is incredible, and we usually ask a lot of our guests since our podcast is focused on basketball. I just want to ask you, what is your first basketball or your favorite basketball memory?
Wow. I was a wannabe athlete in high school. I lived and breathed basketball. I really did. Um, Believe it or not, when the Knicks won the championship in the early '70s, I used to listen on radio. It was not televised, so that's kind of a reference for how old I am. But I used to use my transistor radio and keep track of the games. And Willis Reed, Dave DeBusschere, Walt Frazier. I mean, these were legends to me. So yeah, I kind of grew up with it, and that's probably still my best memory. Really, is Clyde Frazier. And then of course, he's gone on to this amazing career as a commentator, where he's percolating on the baseline. I mean, there's nobody like Clyde. There's just nobody like
Yeah,
him. He personifies New York style.
absolutely. Joe, I want to hop into your coverage of the Tokyo Olympics. I just think that Olympics is fascinating for so many reasons. It has so many questions. And I guess that where I start off on is what was just your strategy just going into those games? It's just so unique for so many reasons, and you're out there just covering it. What was kind of your strategy in terms of the sports that you wanted to cover, and then just in terms of all the restrictions, and then just in terms of the environment? What was kind of your mindset just before you headed to Tokyo, and then when you were there? Like, what was kind of the environment like, and did anything surprise you or shock you, or add or take away from the experience overall?
Sure. That's a kind of a 360 type of question, a lot of points there. First of all, tip of the hat to the Japanese people. They were incredibly gracious. The volunteers who staffed, in multitudes at these various venues were gracious to a fault, helpful, welcoming. I mean, it took 4.5 hours to go through the Tokyo airport upon entry, but my memory is not a bad one because everyone was so helpful along the way. And the goal, of course, was to cross that threshold, get into the country, be negative tested, be allowed to go to your hotel and start to cover the games. So, from my perspective as a photographer, the Olympics are really about joy. It's about the joy of excellence, of striving, the human condition really at its upper tiers in terms of sheer physicality and abilities and competitiveness. So I always look forward to that. The athletes always lift us up, no matter what else is going on. At the 2016 Olympics in Rio, there was Zika, right? Everybody remembers Zika. There's always something. Now, COVID was more than just something. It was a global pandemic. And to stage the games in the middle of those empty stadiums, sometimes it was disheartening, to look up and see no one watching these magnificent athletes. But at the end of the day, it almost seemed like the athletes didn't. This is probably the wrong thing to say, but it's not that they didn't care, but they were involved in their own striving. They were there. The Olympic athlete, I've always had respect, enormous respect. I've shot 4 Olympics and I've done preamble Olympic coverages for many magazines over the years. And you realize these athletes work largely in obscurity. The big time athletes, Carl Lewis and Usain Bolt, they come along once in a generation and they make a lot of money and have a lot of notoriety. Most of those athletes labor in obscurity for years, for that one almost split second on the world stage. So I have tremendous respect for them. And I was keyed up about that. I didn't care about, anything else really. I was only allowed to leave my hotel for 15 minutes at a time when I would come back. I could go to the Family Mart on the corner and buy sandwiches. So I ate sandwiches for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for almost a month, and I didn't care. It's so much work, 18, 20 hours a day. I fell asleep at my station at at track and field. I'm back there with my computer. David Burnett, who's a Olympic legend, photographic legend, came over. We've known each other for 40 years. He's like, dude, you know. So it's an all-out effort. It really is. And my objective was just to celebrate the athletes at the end of the day.
Joe, I wanted to ask you, your body of work is so diverse. You've done so many different areas of photography itself. What is unique about filming, or excuse me, taking photographs in sporting events? What are the different challenges of that? I mean, of course, you have fast-paced motion in a lot of these sports, but as a photographer, what do you kind of take into consideration, versus like a nature shoot or something like that?
Well, yeah, I mean, you mentioned pace, a nature shoot, I mean, obviously animals are their own thing and they're fleeting and elusive. If you're a landscape photographer, that's a whole different ball of wax. But yeah, sports always gets the heart going, and I was a contract photographer with Sports Illustrated for 8 years. And I've done very significant coverages for them over the years. I've never, to be honest, never been all that much of a sideline guy. I'm not that great an action shooter, just not. The respect I have just incredible amount of respect for those photographers who do it incredibly well. You've got Al Bello, at Getty, Donald Morale, shooting now. Over the years, Walter Yost, Heinz Klutmeyer, Johnny Iacona, Manny Milan. These, John Beaver, like John Beaver, was Chicago-based. He would know what the Bears would run at 3rd and 19. The rest of the photographers on the sidelines be like, John would know who they were going to. That's the key to excellent sports photography, is the preamble, the study, the work, the familiarity, the relationships, all that plays into that split second of capture, at that moment in time when the game is tipping one direction or another. And those select photographers are absolutely astonishing at it. Compared to them, I'm an also ran. I've always done sports features. See, here's the thing. I don't know if I should admit this to you guys, but I don't care who wins. I honestly don't care who wins. What I'm interested in about sports is the obsession that lies behind the excellence. If I can portray that somehow, either through the action at the game or through a studio session, a location session, a portrait session, things happen. I've shot covers of major athletes over the years, and there's always some sort of, key, to making something that is revealing about the athlete. So I've always enjoyed the world of sports and been involved in it, even though when it comes down to hardcore action photography, the day-to-day pounded out, football game, weekend stuff, I've always been apart from that.
So it really sounds like you have to have a great appreciation for the sport. I mean, you mentioned the preparation that those photographers are taking of those signlight photos. I mean, you almost have to have just a pure passion for the sport itself in order to get into position to take those shots and display it correctly.
Sure. I mean, the competition is high. How do you find, at Olympics, there's 200, 300 photographers photographing the finish line. How do you do something different? I cite Al Bello again. He's an amazing tennis shooter, for instance, and he knows the light and the angles out of Forest Hills for the U.S. Open so well that he's able to come up with something that transcends coverage and goes on to poetry. There's a difference between documentation and interpretation, and there are very select few sports photographers who find their way to interpretation, which is really where it's at. Bill Frakes with his legendary strip camera, for instance. Bill and I are good friends, and his shot, for instance, from Sydney and Marion Jones. The amount of work that goes in to the moment of exposure. Heinz Klutmeyer. I forget which Olympic it was. It might have been Barcelona. Heinz went over because there are so many photographers and there's competition and there's some negativity that goes on there. You put your clamps down, you come back, you find your wires cut, remotes, that at an Olympic level, that doesn't happen too often. But Heinz took it a step further. Heinz brought over an arc welder. So when he put his clamps on the railings, he welded them to the railings so nobody could move them. That's how competitive this gets.
Wow. And forgive my ignorance. I mean, I assume the number is very low, but when you are doing like a live shoot, not necessarily sports, but I mean, what is a good, are you just hoping to have that one perfect photograph that that can be a keeper, something that you can use, or what is like a good day in a live event?
Oh man. I've never shot the perfect photograph. Sorry, Matt.
Sure.
If you're looking for perfection, you're barking up the wrong tree here. So I'm hoping to get something that's, has an edge to it, maybe a little bit of uniqueness. The strategy, say in an Olympics, and Jimmy Colton, who was my editor of Zuma Press when I was shooting the Olympics for Zuma Press, always counsels. And Jimmy, again, we started as kids together when he was at Newsweek, and then he went on to Sports Illustrated. The heats are where you experiment. Like I got wide play on some pictures that I shot at Rio and at out in Tokyo that were experiments, multiple exposures, handheld multiple exposures, snap zooms. Okay, where you can experiment when the heats are really running and everybody's tussling for that to get a place in the final. You can experiment because that's when the pressure is at its least. When you are down to the gold medal heat, that's when you lock down, and that's when you go for action, and that's when you hopefully don't miss.
Joe, I want to ask you, when you're shooting your cover stories or any other photography job that you're at, I wanted to kind of ask you, when you capture a photo that shows vulnerability and something that might make you uncomfortable, but shows the story that you want to capture, like, are there any conflicting emotions just in terms of that, they're your humans that you're photographing, and that's a vulnerable moment, and that potentially can be shown to the rest of the world. But it's such a great picture. What are kind of the emotions like when you capture that photo that shows a particular vulnerability or just a moment? If we're talking about sports, where it's just the agony of defeat, where it's something that's really emotionally jarring, that all that effort put into this one sporting event, it does not go the athlete's way, and you captured that moment. What are kind of the emotions when you captured that type of photo?
Yeah, I mean, you're always reticent. Well, reticent maybe not the right word. And hesitant is not the right word either. You have to step forward. You have to do your job, but you're also a human being. You can feel the pain. But I always am honest with people. I did a stint years ago for National Geographic where I went down to Texas, and it was a story about human performance. And it was the National Geographic ran it to time for the Millennium Olympics in Sydney. So I was working with a whole variety of athletes in Colorado Springs at the Olympic Center and this and that. And you see the pushing and the striving and the the pain of a workout, et cetera. But I spent some time with this football team, high school football team in Texas, and that was exactly kind of what I was going for. It was like highs and lows, And I told the coach, and we had a little get together with the team. I said, "Look, I will be there if you win and you're celebrating on the field. But if you lose and you're weeping in the locker room, I will be there as well. You have to accept that as the fair exchange."
Mm-hmm.
And they were like, "Yeah, okay, we get it. We get it." When I shot the Olympic team in '96 in the nude for Life magazine, which back in '96 was scandalous. I ended up on Good Morning America and the Today Show, and it's like everybody was like, "Oh my God." Now, with ESPN, the body issue, athletes are just walking around naked. But back then in '96, it was like, ooh, I wasn't after eroticism or, that kind of titillation. One of the elements was I was after, what does sports do to the human body? And I photographed the women's marathon winner. She won the trials, Linda Evans, I believe her name was. And I immediately whisked her from the finish line to a homemade studio in the parking lot next to the finish line. I had a mattress and a blanket for her, and then a stand, and she laid down and she took her shoes and socks off, and then she put her feet up on this prop that I had. And that to me was technically a nude because her feet were naked. But what I was after there in that instance, like, what kind of damage does running 26.2 miles do to the feet? You know, I photographed the American fencer. Oh Lord. And I had him bend, I'll come up with his name in a minute, but I had him bend his foil over his head, and I shot him from the back. And literally his fencing arm was twice the size of his non-fencing arm.
Wow.
You can see it. It's not slight. The arm is enormous. This arm, not so much. So I was after things like that as well. So you see those moments where the body is reacting to the sport, the emotions are involved in the sport. And my feeling is that you have to be honest and straightforward, and you have to do your job, because the good of it and the bad of it are all part of the story.
Joe, I want to also ask you, your portfolio is so diverse. This is kind of a basic question. Which of the genres of photography is your most favorite, or just kind of you enjoy shooting, or even the opposite way, whatever way you want to take the question? What are the challenging genres when you go out to just a photography shoot that might prompt more just preparation and just kind of prep time and going into it?
Sure, good question. I mean, the umbrella aspect, or you can lump me under the umbrella of people photographer. If people are doing it, I'm interested in it. I'm not the kind of photographer who backpacks into the woods and just don't do it. I appreciate the people who do. They do marvelous work, but it ain't me. So I would say that sports and movement. Here's a huge interest for me, and this covers sports. Is I've always been in love with performers. I'm always fascinated by someone who can get on stage, be they an athlete, a dancer, an actor, a circus performer, you name it. Anybody who can say, or be confident enough in their own skills and excellence to say, okay, I'm going to get on stage and you're going to pay money to come see me. That to me is pretty cool. So I'm always interested in that life. I have a lot of friends who perform down in Vegas, and there's a real overlap in Vegas between Olympic athlete skill and the performance on the stages. You think it's all glitz and this and that. It's hard work. The O show down there, which is the water show with Cirque du Soleil, has an enormous number of former Olympians. Synchronized swimmers, divers, swimmers. They're all in there because more than half of the show is conducted in the water. These people are holding their breaths for an enormous amount of time. They're diving from tremendous heights. Their body control is amazing. So yes, there's this fascination I've had my whole life, photographic life, for performers, particularly ballet. I love the art form of the ballet, and I suggested to Sports Illustrated once years ago, and they rejected it. A story, basketball and ballet. I wanted to go to various cities and take one of the star basketball players from the NBA and match them up in a studio with a prima ballerina, and see how the moves would sync up or what they would be like. And never got it done. But yeah, to me, when a human being strives for excellence, and that's oftentimes what we are sent to do as photographers. We witness excellence. You're not put on assignment to go down the block and photograph your neighbor, as wonderful as they are. You're sent someplace because somebody or something they're involved in is extraordinary.
Yeah, and in terms of just kind of your eye when you're on assignment, I mean, I'm guessing you're following what's interesting to you personally, but what's kind of the key to your eye for photography for getting those photos that interest you?
I look oftentimes for oddity. And the juxtaposition of elements. I've taken ballerinas to some very unlikely places, for instance, that there's not supposed to be a ballerina there. Wait a minute, and I've inserted ballerinas into tableaus. I do like tableaus where there's multiple things. As a viewer of your photograph, say I'm the viewer of this photograph. I want to be entertained. I'm bombarded with visuals. Instagram, click, 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 click. What makes someone stop and get involved with your photograph? Oftentimes, that's the oddly beautiful nature of it, or it could be the fact that there's multiple things going on in a tableau. In other words, there's things going on foreground, middle ground, background. So you draw the eye of the viewer into your photograph and make them commit to actually spending a few seconds with it, or maybe even more. So I do seek the interaction of the odd and the beautiful. I seek multiple things going on, foreground, middle ground, background. Those kinds of photographs really resonate with me.
That's a perfect segue to another question I wanted to ask you regarding Instagram, actually, is with Instagram being so huge now, I mean, is it a pro or a con as a photographer? Because just being inundated with all of these photos, does it in some ways make it easier for you to stand out in taking an excellent photograph? Or is it harder to get people's attention, or neither of the above? I mean, is it not really affecting the photography game?
Well, it is affecting. Yeah, there's no two ways about it. It's probably the largest photographic playing field out there on the internet, and certainly we maintain a presence on Instagram. We put up a new Instagram this morning. Yeah, we tend to chime in about twice a week, and we tend to try to time the entries for a trend, a time of year, an event that's going on, all that kind of thing. So is it good or is it bad? I don't know, man. The jury's kind of out on that. It's a flurry, that's for sure. It's a way to be seen. Certain art directors prowl Instagram looking for potential talent. That can happen. I've almost got a couple of assignments off of Instagram, but that kind of aspect of it has quieted down. The wonderful thing is that it gives you a voice. You don't have to wait for an assignment to go, quote unquote, publish something. You can talk about your work. You can put it out there in the field. You can dupe it on Facebook. You can dupe it on Twitter, et cetera. You can go in a well-rounded way to see if you can gather an audience. And gathering an audience is part of staying alive nowadays as a photographer. When I would shoot a cover of National Geographic, for instance, this was kind of in the pre-digital era, even though I shot some in the digital era. The magazine would stay on the stands for a month. People would talk about it. Cover of Life, people talked about it. It wasn't fleeting. I always remind young photographers, especially, it's like, oh wow, I got like 2,000 likes. It's like it ain't the same as $2,000. Likes are cheap and easy. How do you sustain yourself? How do you drive yourself to a point where this thing that you love also sustains your life?
To that point, Joe, I want to ask you about just the evolving technology as well, just because now, to Matt's point, everybody has the ability just to shoot just photos instantaneously. And like you were saying, get their work out to millions of people. And just from your own, foresight and just based on your experience, where do you see kind of the playing field in terms of technology, in terms of like handheld devices and taking, photos? You see where it's just like, a DSLR has the exact same technology as, what the iPhone or Google or what Samsung's putting out, or it's just like a completely neutral playing field. And then it just comes down to basically creativity and just experience and just trying to evoke that emotion. Kind of, where do you see kind of the industry going in your opinion in the future?
Again, good question, and hard to know and hard to answer. No crystal balls here, but I keep pace with the technology. I appreciate the technology. I'm shooting the Nikon Z9 now, which is a beast of a camera. It's phenomenal, the things that it can do, the accuracy of the autofocus, all those things that cover the waterfront that you used to have to worry about tremendously as a photographer. Again, dating myself here, but I started shooting, I shot with Nikon Fs and F2s, So that's why I just have to chuckle if I hear any of the internet folks out there complaining about the cameras. It's like, you know, really, there's not that much to complain about. But yeah, I mean, certainly the smartphone thing has devastated, certain aspects of the larger camera manufacturers' playing field. The compact cameras and stuff have, oftentimes or by and large gone by the wayside. Everybody's got a pretty sophisticated camera now if you've got a decent iPhone or Samsung or something like that. But it's also a question, and I see some very creative work being done with smartphones. Not taken away from it at all. But the larger step, if you will, into the DSLR mirrorless realm gives you enormous ability to adapt and to change your perspective. There's not a heck of a lot. I know there's shifts you can make now with the smartphones, go from wide to telephoto, but still, the timing, it's not there. A real serious reach with a lens, not there. Sharpness, ultimately, not there. You don't want to shoot somebody's wedding on a smartphone. The results are going to be, the occasional snap is going to be wonderful, but if you're going to stay in the professional realm of this, you're still staying with professional cameras, and those will be, I think, the signature of anyone going forward who's going to make a mark as a professional.
Well, Joe, we really appreciate this interview. Very fascinating. Thank you very much for taking time to speak with us. Can you let our listeners and viewers know where they can find you in terms of either social media or with your website, and any projects we should be on the lookout for, and also where our viewers can find the book as well?
Sure. The new book that's out is called The Real Deal: Field Notes from the Life of a Working Photographer. It's kind of a hopefully fun, entertaining, and educational meander through the life of a working photographer, and that title was chosen very advisedly, because that's what I've done for all this time. I've worked at this. You work at it, you get better at it. Hopefully you have good days and bad days. Instagram is Joe McNally Photo. Our website, which we've updated and has actually the Tokyo Olympic, a chapter there, a portfolio is up there, is joemcnally.com. And then pretty much once weekly, we write an amazing, fascinating, well-written, erudite blog. Did I just self-plug myself?
Go on, do it.
McNally.com/blog. It's a fun look at the industry on the odd occasion, for sure.
Joe, we appreciate the time. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, guys.